of our team, I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar, a webinar that close to 1,500 people have registered for. Wherever you are on Turtle Island today, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous peoples. We are bringing today's webinar from the Learning Network, funded by the Ministry of the Status of Women here in Ontario, and the Knowledge Hub, funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. Today's webinar is Trauma Informed Interventions through an Indigenous Worldview, and will be presented by Brianna Olson. I'll introduce her shortly, but first I want to share the format of our webinar. Brianna is going to present for 1 hour. And during her presentation, we invite you to type any comments or questions that you have for Brianna into the Q&A box, the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. During the last 15 minutes of our webinar, from 2 to 2:15, I will present as many of your questions as we can to our presenter for her response. At the end of the webinar, in the chat box, you will see a link to the evaluation for the webinar. And please note, this webinar, we're trying something new, and this will be the only opportunity you have to obtain the link. And the reason we are doing that is so that we're sure that the only people that receive certificates of attendance are people that were actually present in order to obtain the link for the evaluation. And speaking of evaluation, we really count on your responses, and we use those to inform us and to plan for future webinars. And once you complete the evaluation form, you'll be directed to a website where you'll be prompted to enter your full name and email address. And that enables a certificate of attendance to be generated and emailed to you. The presentation slides and the webinar recording will be posted on our website within the next few days. And once posted, an email will be sent out to all those who have registered for this webinar. In response to requests from participants in past webinars, our team has prepared questions for you to consider individually or in discussion with others to help you process and debrief this webinar. We sent the questions to you with the link for today's webinar. You'll also find the questions in the chat box. We also wanted to let you know that the content of this or other webinars from the Learning Network and the Knowledge Hub may cause distress, as we hope to continue to deal with challenging content, and we want to encourage you to take care of yourself. And we have provided links in the chat box to supports that are for your use, should you want to follow up with those. Brianna Olson, our presenter. Brianna is a social worker, a diverse multimedia artist, and a member of the Wikwamakan Unceded First Nation. She brings a wealth of frontline, facilitation, management, and consultation experiences. Brianna is now living in Toronto, completing her master's in social work with an Indigenous Trauma and Resiliency specialization. She works part-time at Ryerson University as a teaching and research assistant, and at Indigenous agencies across Toronto, such as the Native Canadian Centre, Peel Aboriginal Network, Native Women's Resource Centre, and Native Child and Family Services. Our team had the good fortune of meeting and learning from Brianna at the Learning Network Sexual Violence Forum earlier this year. And on the spot, we decided that we wanted to invite her to present this webinar. So Brianna, thank you so much, and we're going to turn it over to you.
Miigwech. Ani minigishagad Brianna Olson pedwanquet minwa wasaje nim tanangus kwe Anishinaabe Bimatisiwin Karanto Mampi and Dunjaba Amiskachi Waskahagan Minwa Wakamkong Sing unceded First Nation and in Dunjaba Anishinaabe Kwe and Dao Atakus and Odem. Hello everyone, it's a very beautiful day, and my name is Brianna Olson Pedawanakwet. I'm also, my Anishinaabe name is Wasaje Nim Tanangus Kwe, which means shining, dancing star woman. I'm a member of Wakwamikong Unceded First Nation, and I am currently living in Toronto and grew up in a place called Amiskwachi, Waskahegan, which is Cree for Beaver Hills House, or otherwise known as Edmonton. I am a Anishinaabe woman. I also have Irish and Norwegian descent on my father's side, and am part of the Caribou reindeer clan. So I am really, really, really honored to be here today. I'd like to thank every single person who's tuning in right now, who has taken the time out of their day to participate in this webinar. And I think it's just amazing that all across Turtle Island right now, we're able to share in this learning opportunity together. Throughout the webinar, I will, I'll be encouraging you all to think and bring your own wisdom to the forefront. And hopefully following the webinar, this will give you a bit of a framework as to move forward with in terms of trauma-informed care. And then in that way you can insert, some of your own knowledge and some of the teachings from your own communities. And I want to acknowledge that there are, diverse communities that are tuning in here, and that whatever I share with you today is what I've learned along my journey. And it's certainly not the be-it end-all of trauma-informed care or interventions. You can take what works for you, you can leave what doesn't work for you, and this is certainly the way that I have done teaching throughout my career. So with that, I will give you a bit of background on what our wonderful host there shared with you, a bit about what my background is. But I will give you a little bit more insight. I lived in Edmonton my entire life, spending much of my time here in Ontario in Wakwamikong with my family. Have lived here now for 2 years, and I'm currently doing the Indigenous Trauma and Resiliency Master's Program in Social Work at the University of Toronto. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Victoria in the Indigenous specialization in social work there, and worked for over a decade doing frontline service in Edmonton in the inner city. It was during that time that I honed my skills, and have always been really passionate about grassroots communities and solutions and work that is coming from the people in the community themselves, that are the people in the community are leading the work and leading the solutions. I've sat on different committees with the government, within the city of Edmonton, within the province, within the Children's Advocate Office, and was really honored to work for a decade at a place called iHuman Youth Society in Edmonton, where I was a manager, and and worked with generally marginalized populations, with families, with youth, specifically doing the arts, and also have a background as a perinatal outreach worker. So I am a doula, have supported moms and children through early intervention and support. So that is me. And if you don't mind, we could just move on to the next slide here. Great. All right, so as I said, I'm a member of Wacomiconga Unceded First Nation, Manitoulin Minising, which is Manitoulin Island, and a big shout out to anybody from Wiki right now who's watching. I also know that Chiging was advertising this presentation, so maybe there's some people from there as well. And I'd like to say Ani. And my Cree elder from out west told me that, explained it to me and within the Neheawawin language, that when you introduce yourself in that language, you say Nitsikasun. So the root of that is Nitsi, and Nitsi refers to our belly button. And that's the connection that we have to the land, to the homelands, to the land of our ancestors. And that is very important. So that's something that I always recognize and acknowledge. It's a beautiful thing. I've been from the Arctic to the desert down south in Albuquerque, and I've always introduced where I'm from, and I've met people from my community all over Turtle Island, and relatives from north to south, east to west. And so that's a huge reason as to why I'm very proud of where I'm from and why I always take the time to acknowledge that. So next slide. All right. So my other home is Miskachi, Waskahigan. I want to give a acknowledgement to anybody from there who might be listening right now, including my old workplace of Human Youth Society. This is a very special picture for me. I am a jingle dress dancer, and this was a picture from home in Edmonton during the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation final march that took place in several years ago. And it was during that time that this was the end of the march, and the march began with us, the jingle dress dancers, leading 10,000 people, survivors and allies and community members for a healing march. And within this picture, there are Blackfoot, Sioux, Nehiyaw, Anishinaabe relations that I'm dancing alongside, including some of my most influential teachers and mentors, Karen Pheasant and Lillian Gadwa, who are huge influence in my life. And the reason that I share this is because my jingle dress informs much of how I live my life, how I operate, how I relate with people. It's a part of my ethical self. And even though I take my jingle dress off, I'm still representing that dress. I'm still carrying that dress in all other parts of my life. So I try to walk with respect. I try to walk with dignity, and I try to do the best that I can in all aspects of my life and in relationships with people. So that's the reason that I share that with you. And the other reason that I'm sharing all of this to preface my presentation is that I think positionality is very important. I always identify as an Indigenous social worker. That's a part of who I am, and it doesn't separate from my role as a social worker. I also think it's important to that we remain accountable to the people that we, to the people in our communities. So I share all of this because I want to remain accountable, and to my home, to my homes, I guess you could say. And yeah, so from there we can go to the next slide. Great. All right. So essentially what I've compiled here is just an outline of our journey together today. I'd like to give a brief disclaimer before we start that on the sensitive nature of the workshop today. I have put together the workshop so that there's no specific detailed stories in regards to abuse or violence, but I will be referencing topics of abuse, violence, as well as abuse of children. And I would like to give everyone a heads up before we begin. I would encourage members of the webcast to support your teammates, to engage potentially in a debrief afterwards, to have smudge available. I have my smudge right here. And that's how I began the webcast today for myself. And yeah, I think it's just great if we have that opportunity to talk about the material afterwards. It helps to synthesize what we've learned and to potentially apply it to what we are doing. So what I've provided here is essentially a map of our journey together. I think that this gives you all a bit of a heads up as to what you're getting yourselves into. And it's essentially a cognitive map that we are going to use to develop a deeper understanding of trauma and of everything that is part of that as well. So, all right. So first, we'll gain a basic understanding of the brain-body connection, of our body and brain survival responses, and Indigenous philosophies of higher thought and wisdom. Unpack and problematize Western pathology in relation to trauma, and consider approaches to supporting trauma rooted in a holistic paradigm. So, next slide. All right, so this is a really wordy slide. I'm not huge on slides, but I think that this could be a good reminder for people who are taking this, is that maybe you might have an opportunity to print this off or get the slides. But this is how I have navigated my practice to date. And I think that it's really, it's been really helpful for me and really helpful for other people that are working alongside social work. So working across disciplines is something that I've been very passionate about since getting into social work. In order to get a real whole view of the world and the profession that we're working in, and the many ways that it intersects with other professions, we need to not only be studying our own helping profession, but also having conversations outside of it. So in keeping with a holistic worldview, we must not run the risk of compartmentalizing our helping work or our own competency. Learning across disciplines will only foster a deeper understanding of the material that we're working with. I would encourage, so this goes into the area of land and environment and history. Study the history of your territory, you know, whatever First Nations, if you are a First Nation, you know, looking back, talking to your band, talking to elders in your community, looking at the history of your own nation as to what that looked like. History, and then for people who are potentially allies, I would say the same thing. It's very important that you know the history of the land that you are on. The history of the current helping models, the models that are, I guess, the most dominant or most popular within your own field. I would encourage all of you to look at the history of those helping models. Where did they come from? Where did they originate? Is this something that has had contention? Is there a history of success with the model? Those type of things. Next would be looking into the area of law. Study the race-based legal principles that continue to impact First Peoples of Turtle Island. That would be legal principles such as the Doctrine of Discovery. The Indian Act is a good example. And know the law that underpins the work that you do in the community. I would say that every single decision that we make, every single conversation that we have, every service plan that we write, or whatever it may be, there's certainly going to be some legal principles that are underpinning that. And I would encourage everyone to start to look into what those might be. And then also, I think most importantly, is in knowing the inherent rights of First Nation people on Turtle Island. This is something that there's lots of literature on it. And I would say the University of Victoria, as well as the University of British Columbia, are putting out a lot of really valuable work right now. Dr. John Burrows from Cape Croker First Nation is also a brilliant legal scholar in this area, as well as Sylvia McAdam, who began Idle No More. Next is the environment. Learn about the environment, learn about climate change, resource extraction, and the ways that Indigenous peoples are impacted most by these policies. There is literature out there, certainly, and there is, I think this is one of the largest, most critical issues that our generation has to contend with. It's very good to know these things. And next is knowing the most up-to-date info on health in regards to First Nation people. There has been essentially there's been a lack of a lot of research on health in Indigenous communities lately. This is something that people are starting to put a lot more energy in to turn that around. And this is something that is very critical to our people. Learn about the most up-to-date research on science and the brain, and learn about your own nation's healing paradigms. And yeah, I think at the bottom of the day, like the most important thing is to start conversations, foster relationships with professionals, you know, outside of your field, potentially with legal offices in your area, you know, talking with lawyers, talking with health professionals, doctors, going for coffee, you know, having those discussions, I think is really valuable. And it's helped me a lot to start to understand the big picture of the work that we're doing. So next slide. Great. All right, so this is a picture by Aaron Paquette. Aaron Paquette's a really brilliant Métis artist from Edmonton. And this is where I will preface, I guess, the workshop in terms of how we're looking at trauma from an Indigenous worldview. So through Indian eyes is a term that my late uncle, Elder Isaac Pidwanaquit would use. It's a term that he would say whenever we were having a conversation about issues that our community is dealing with, about different current events that are going on in the world. He would always say to me, look at it through Indian eyes. And I always wondered what he meant by that. And I asked him, and he said that essentially what you're doing is you're looking at the problem, you're looking at the issue from an Indigenous worldview, from the view and the lived experience of our people and the perspective of our people. So what does this mean? What I've taken this to mean is that what we're doing when we're looking through Indian eyes is that we're seeing the world from 14,000 years of experience here on Turtle Island. From Wakwamacong in particular, the island is, the scientists are now finding that it's 14,000 years that Indigenous, our people have lived there. However, our creation stories say that it's time immemorial. So essentially what we're doing is we're looking at the world through those 14,000 years of wisdom, experience, and connection to the land here on Turtle Island. And it's 14,000 years of knowledge, of complex functioning intact societies that had everything, you know, healthcare, governance, education, infrastructure, science. The last, 500 plus years since contact have been a relatively small amount of time within that 14,000 years of knowledge. So Indigenous people are certainly, rallying to bring that knowledge to the forefront today. And that's a huge gift to all of us. And next, this is something that I want to preface this. Oh, not next on the slide. Sorry, thank you. All right. We really need to be able to challenge and abandon the Eurocentric notion that Indigenous peoples were or are inferior. That we only need to listen to scholars such as Dr. Leroy Littlebear, Dr. Roberta Jameson, to really understand the vast contributions that Indigenous people have made and the inherent genius that is available with Indigenous science and philosophies. including things like democracy and environmental sustainability. Those are two contributions that Indigenous people have made to this land that don't often get recognized for the wealth that they have contributed to our society. And if we look at non-Indigenous allies, such as Dr. David Suzuki, who's one of the foremost leaders on environment on Turtle Island, he has specifically said that Indigenous people carry the wisdom today to save our planet, which is no small comment, and I think is very telling. So we will, I noticed that there's some people that have questions, and I'll just give a preface that there will be 15 minutes for questions at the end of the webinar. And if you could just hold on, maybe write down the question, whatever you need to do to keep it in your mind, that would be great. And thank you. And in terms of the slides, I'm not too sure if you guys can print them off afterwards, but that's something that we can just clarify at the end of the presentation. So next slide. Great, thank you. So what I'm going to try to do is talk a bit slower than I usually talk. This is one of the criticisms that I often get from my mentors in public speaking, is you talk too fast sometimes when you get on a roll. So I'm going to try to slow it down for everyone so that you are, that you're not missing anything. All right, so what we're gonna do now is an exercise. It's really fun. And this is an exercise that happens actually with children to help them understand the brain, to help them understand the way that their brains work. And it's also very helpful when working with adults. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to put our hand up like this. And this is going to give us, an understanding of how our brain processes information from one part to the other. And what happens when our brain gets overwhelmed or overloaded, and how trauma can be a result on the outset. So everyone can put their hands up. So essentially this is going to be our brain here. This is our brain stem, the very bottom of our brain here. This is moving up into like the midbrain where our knuckles are. And then as we come around to the front, this is our frontal cortex. So our nails there in the front are going to be our frontal cortex. So that's this part of the brain here, midbrain, right in the middle there. And then the lower brain is our amygdala. All right, so if everyone wants to follow along, you're more than welcome to. If not, that's fine, you could just watch. So what happens when we are going through our daily lives is that our brain is processing from the bottom up. So bottom up processing happens because our brains, the most primitive part of our brain, or our, the survival part of our brain, is located at the lower portion of our brain in the back here, our amygdala. And when information comes in, it is processed first by our amygdala. And this is a part of our brain that takes care of things like survival, our fight, flight, and freeze responses come from this part of the brain. So the information comes in, and then it's moving up through the midbrain, our knuckles, and then coming around to our frontal cortex. So our midbrain is kind of where we're, our memories, our emotions, our limbic system is located in that area, and is processed then through there, and then moves up to our frontal cortex, where we start to make some of our highest thinking is there. Our decision-making, our complex thought, abstract thought is located in that part of the brain. So let's say we're having a bad day. Toronto is a good example. There's tons of traffic here. There's lots of stuff that goes on the roads. You end up getting stuck in traffic for hours and hours. I'm going to use myself as an example. I'm driving through traffic. Somebody zooms up and cuts me off and drives right in front of me. I just about hit them. And I get really, at this point, I've been sitting in traffic for an hour. I'm getting a bit worked up. I'm impatient. So there have been, so the car cuts me off, and immediately my brain goes into survival mode. What I'm processing is that I'm in danger. I'm in danger. I'm afraid. My brain is firing on all cylinders, and my reaction is fear and anger. So it comes up through here, and then as that information reaches my midbrain, I have a lot of association. So I've been in numerous car accidents, and my association is that I'm in danger, and that I immediately go back to those car accidents start coming up. And this is a process that happens within 1 to 3 seconds, how information is coming in through our brain. And then essentially what is happening is that the threshold of in my brain is overwhelmed. So essentially that information is not necessarily meeting my frontal cortex. My brain is flooded. I have a response that is not necessarily a good one, and I flip the guy the bird. I get very angry, I get very upset. And essentially what happens is that the connection, this is what we call flipping our lid. So flip the lid, and essentially what's happening is that our frontal cortex is not necessarily connecting with the rest of our brain when we flip our lid. So this is a very simple, broken down example of the connections that happen throughout the brain and how the brain processes, and how when an upsetting or traumatic experience happens, how our brain can be flooded, and we don't necessarily have that connection between the lower brain and the frontal cortex. The threshold is flooded. What can happen is that we can be agitated, we can lose coordination and impulsivity. And my example was that in that moment, I might get angry, I might swear, I might, this is something that, again, that I said is shared with children to just help them to understand how their brain processes information and what happens when their brain gets overwhelmed. And we can move on to the next slide. Great. All right. So our brain, again, like I said, works from the bottom up. This is and I'm not sure what's going on here. My slide has been blocked. Oh, there we go. All right. So like I said, the amygdala, the base of the brain, is controlling our body temperature, all of the most basic survival parts of our being, our heart rate, our blood pressure, our sleep, and our appetite. And then from there, we move into our midbrain. So that would be this part here in the middle. And that would be like where our diencephalon and our limbic system is. And our things like our hypothalamus are in that area. And this is the part of our brain that regulates emotions, memory, sleep, our hormones. It directs sensory impulses throughout our entire body. So what's happening is that all of the impulses that our body is feeling, all of the things that all of the sensations that we're having are coming from this area, from the diencephalon. And it works with the limbic system to generate and manage emotions and memories. So it kind of would make sense as to how there's a reaction or something that's taking place, and our amygdala is seeing it as like a fight, flight, or freeze response. It's moving up into our midbrain, and sometimes people have flashbacks. Sometimes people have. So this is the area where our memory is, our memories and our emotions are controlled, and naturally, all of the parts of the brain work together to process incoming information. Our brain is brilliant and is controlling all of this information that we're getting. We're getting, millions and millions of pieces of information a day, and our brain is managing all of this information that's coming in from the bottom up. The next part of our brain is our frontal cortex right here. As many of you who have done work with people who have FASD, this is the part of the brain that is largely impacted by fetal alcohol spectrum. And this is the part of the brain that's responsible for abstract thought, for concrete thought, for affiliation with other human beings, and for attachment. So what is happening sometimes is when we are having traumatic incidents, some of the information and some of the processing is kind of getting, finding it's in the lower and the midbrain, and is not necessarily sometimes finding its way to the frontal cortex. So what I have shared with you, oh, and this is what I'll just, I think, finish with, is that triggers, so we've heard the term triggers quite a bit in your work. It's a pretty popular term right now. Triggers are essentially information that the brain perceives as a threat. Memory, smells, emotions, body sensations, sleep can all be perceived as threatening and misinterpreted by the brain from the amygdala through the midbrain. It's not necessarily integrating and making its way to the frontal cortex. So what is very interesting about this is that our brain does not register time when it is in that place of hyperactivity. So if you are, let's say, the moment that that car cut me off, my body, like, you know, I felt it through my body. I felt all that rush of adrenaline. I got angry. I got worked up. I got scared. My brain did not perceive that I was in a different situation than the first car accident that I was in. My body reacted as if I was still in that car accident, that car was going to hit me and I was going to be in trouble. So our brain does not necessarily register time when it is in that triggered space. What I've shared here is a really good quote by Dr. Bruce Perry that essentially shows some of the things that come up around these triggers and this trauma. Children exposed to significant threats will reset their baseline state of arousal, such that even at baseline, when no threats or demands are present, they will be in a psychological state of persisting alarm. As external stressors are introduced, example, a complicated task, a disagreement with a peer, or in my case, getting cut off in traffic, the traumatized child or adult will become more reactive, moving into a state of fear or terror even at the face of minor stressors. The child's cognition or behavior will reflect his or her state of arousal. This increased baseline level of arousal and increased reactivity in response to a perceived threat play a major role in the behavior and cognitive problems exhibited by traumatized children. So essentially what this quote is saying is that in people who have complex trauma or persistent trauma, a lot of their brain process is taking place here in the amygdala and kind of in the midbrain, but everything is turned on all the time in the amygdala. They are constantly in a state of hyperarousal or constantly perceiving that things are a threat because you've been conditioned that way. If you've always been around violence, if you've always been around threats to your wellness and well-being and safety, your brain is on hyperdrive. It's on hyper alert. And that doesn't allow for processing necessarily all the energies down here. And there's not a whole lot going that is moving up into the frontal cortex of the brain. All right, so we can move into the next slide. And what I want to say is that all behavior is a result of brain processes. Try to understand and empathize with why the client or person that you see or meet or your friend or whoever it might be, try to understand why they're behaving that way. What is the root of it? What is the story? What is going on? And I think that that's something that all of this has taught me is to just be more understanding and to really get that people are doing things because of their brain processes, that sometimes it's not necessarily a clear cut answer as to, oh, they're doing it for this reason, or they're doing it for that, or they're, you know, that sometimes it could just be an automatic response that they might be having. All right, so this is our hopeful slide. This is what I have fully come to in the work that I've done with trauma, and my own trauma work that I've done. I will give you all a very brief preface on my own life story and history as to why I do this work. So I had been involved in a lot of violence and whatnot when I was younger, and trauma. I was involved in gang involvement, with street involvement, different things like that when I was growing up. And it was because of this that I became passionate about coming into the field of social work. I truly believe that there needs to be more people with lived experience in the field, and so that they can share from both sides of the fence. I also am a child survivor of suicide, so I lost a parent to suicide, and have dealt with my own history of intergenerational trauma, with having a minocamus in residential school, and navigating that in our family. And so yeah, certainly this is something that I've come to on my own journey as well, as personally and professionally. So I'm speaking from both perspectives right now. So we are alive. We are alive because our brains were brilliant, wise, and courageous enough to keep us safe when we are in danger. Trauma responses are survival responses. That part of our brain, our amygdala, that is navigating the world around us, has kept us alive. I cannot tell you how many situations I've been in my life where, you know, my reaction was instinctual, and I'm sure many of you can say the same. So we talk about the word resilience quite often. What is resilience? It's our ability as human beings to survive no matter what the circumstances. And there are, you know, that's really for me what it comes down to at the base of it, is that resilience is survival. Our brains have protected us. And for this reason, quite often, you know, we hear the word trauma and we're kind of like, you know, people cringe, and what does that mean? And it's essentially that, you know, we've gone through some things in our lives, and that our brain, our trauma has been a result of some things, but essentially we are alive because our brain has been resilient enough to protect us. So with that, I always am careful about using terms such as maladaptive or pathological, because those responses have served us in some way. All right, so we can move on to our next slide. Great. So my Anishinaabe teacher, Nanotik Penguish, has taught me that Nendam, we say Chinendam, or in our language, like happy or in a good state of mind. Nendam denotes a state of mind in Anishinaabe language. Self-regulation is a term that is used quite often in the field. So self-regulation is maintaining autonomy over our thought processes in order to control our bodies. So essentially, all self-regulation is that we are autonomous over what is going on in our mind, so that we can control how our bodies are moving through this world. My uncle, my late uncle, Isaac Pedawanaqut, stated that Anishinaabe Anishinaabic thought denotes genius. This is something I've also heard from one of my elders, Stanley Peltier. And what I've taken that to mean in my conversations with them about trauma is that this is the part of our brain that our ancestors thought with, that we think with when we are working to be able to process all of that input that's coming in, that we are thinking with the most logical part of our brain. We are thinking from that eagle perspective. I have a friend who's an Eagle Clan, and she talks about this all the time. We're thinking from that higher place above ourselves. And this is our highest thought processes that are located in our frontal cortex. So there were many ways, and this is what I've been, talking with elders all over about, is how our ways of life would naturally help our people to process all that information and trauma, so that it was that we were thinking with this part of our brain. So with that, we can move on to the next slide. And that essentially means that we're thinking, that we're thinking with a good mind, I think, is what a term that's often used is the term good mind. And I know, there is a lot within Haudenosaunee that talks culture that talks about good mind. So how are we doing things with a good mind? And so now that we're going to be moving into a deeper understanding of trauma with all of that information that I just provided, I'll share a few key points with you. The systems that we work in often view behavior through a moral or a basic psychology lens, through behavior modification, reward and punishment. So somebody did something wrong, we are going to either reward or we're going to punish them. I worked in group homes for much of my life, and I saw that model was used quite frequently. I can tell you right now, and this is something that Dr. Bruce Perry says quite often, is that children and youth who have complex trauma do not react to punishment the same way that other people do. They perceive punishment as exclusion. They view punishment as humiliating, and if you've constantly been punished your entire life, if you've constantly been abused, punishment is not viewed through the same lens as other people. So that's something that I'll kind of start with there. Next, the new, sorry, I'm just having to move this thing around my screen here just so I can see all the words. The new and most groundbreaking research shows us the complexity, resilience, and neuroplasticity of the human brain, the deep and lasting impacts of prolonged abuse, and the body's amazing adaptation for survival. So like I said before, our body's responses to trauma have kept us alive. And what we're essentially trying to help ourselves and other people do is to move those experiences into the frontal cortex to help to process that information and to be able to work with our whole brain when we're moving through this world. And, all of those responses may have been, those survival responses may have been positive in that moment. They may have kept us alive in that moment, but sometimes people are moving on in their lives, still living with that trauma response, still existing and still dictating a lot of how their brain is firing. So what we're trying to do is just process that and to help integrate that into our brain so that we can walk through this world with a good mind. Looking at trauma and the resulting behavior as resilience and survival, a starting point for healing, rather than pathologizing, ostracizing, or criminalizing, which is a lot of what happens with our people. Recognizing that there are very few spaces investing the time necessary for true integrative healing of complex trauma. So this is where we're going to go into a bit more around that. Next slide. All right. So what we are going to look at now is the history. So we need to understand the history of the systems that we find ourselves in. When we look at the history of settlers before the contact was made here, specifically European settlers, the history of what was going on there was largely, it was very different than what was happening here on Turtle Island. There was a feudal system that was taking place. And within this society, we saw a hierarchy. So at the very top of it was the Pope and the church, monarchs, nobles, knights. And then at the very bottom of that was peasants and serfs, people who were essentially in servitude for their entire lives. This is the culture that existed. This is the model of society that existed prior to contact. And much of that was brought here. Dr. Roberta Jameson talks about how the concept of democracy, the concept of people being a chief, being on the same level as the people, was very new when settlers arrived here. So this is where the concept of democracy that we see today in our society is from Indigenous people, because this is the model that was used prior to. Critical work does not mean that we're criticizing everything. Critical work does not mean that we're, side-eyeing every theory that comes at us. Critical work, for me, means acknowledging the historical, social, and political nature of the systems that we work in, so that we really understand why things are the way that they are in our society today. So the concept of normal came largely from this place in history. So if you're unable to work within this settler nation in Europe prior to contact here, if you're unable to work, you were considered essentially excluded, you were useless, and your worth was largely tied to your productivity. So if you were unable to make your own work, if you were not the middle class, you could be sentenced to a workhouse, essentially a jail, with a poor quality of living and no health care. If you didn't fit into the workhouse, so this would be for people with disabilities, people who are not able-bodied, potentially someone with mental health issues, maybe somebody who was identified as trans or gay or lesbian. If you didn't fit into the workhouse, you may be sent to something called an asylum. So asylums were one of the first origins of what we see now as like mental health facilities, hospitals, these kind of things. This gave rise to largely the models that we see today, is that people were then labeled or pathologized as being ill, and they didn't fit into any of the spaces in society. So they created these spaces for them. Institutions were essentially jails. They were privately run and became a money-making model so people would get money the more people that came into the asylums. This is where the concept of normal and able-bodied came from, is that if you were not working, if you were not contributing, if you're not paying taxes to the king and the queen, then you were part of this disenfranchised community. And we very much see that model persisting, some of those philosophies today. All right, we'll move into the next slide. So if anyone's ever studied narrative therapy, it's essentially looking at how the systems around us impact us. The problem is not the person, the problem is the systems. So problematizing the systems and not our people. Western mainstream society operates from a normative viewpoint. What is not considered normal behavior, lifestyle, race, disability, sexual orientation, or identity, you may find yourself disenfranchised or marginalized. Essentially, you were outside of the circle. You did not fit in the circle. And we see much of this today, is that there are, where the disenfranchisement is pervasive. Othering or pathology created the basis for many of the systems that we see today. We can't ignore the roots of, we especially see this south of the medicine line in the United States, the for-profit jail systems, the for-profit health systems, and lastly, this will tie it all together, the biomedical model posits that all physical and mental illness are due to measurable physiological deviations from normal, healthy functioning. The biomedical model's exclusion of psychological and social factors are essential to mental illness has led to a number of criticisms of the model. So the biomedical model is not necessarily a holistic model. It's not looking at the person's environment. It's not looking at the social factors that are contributing to that. And this is largely the model that exists today within our healthcare systems, is the biomedical model. All right, so we can move to the next slide. Great. So this is another quote from Dr. Bruce Perry. This is talking about children and youth, but I would just take a step back and reflect that youth, traumatized youth, and like as an Indigenous person, we understand that much of that trauma doesn't just go away when you turn 18, that we live with it in our communities. Many people live with it as adults as well. So this could also apply. It is a sad reality that all of our best efforts, all of our government programs, our nonprofits, our public and private institutions, our child welfare, our education, mental health, and juvenile justice systems fail the highest risk children. We create the chaos, fragmentation, trauma, and neglect these children have experienced in their homes. We fail maltreated children in many ways, not the least of which is an appalling lack of effective therapeutic services for these children. Most of these children have limited access to therapeutic services. Those who do get therapy get too little too late. How can we possibly expect 45 minutes a week with a therapist to heal a child after 10 years of chaos, threat, humiliation, degradation, and terror? And so that pretty much sums it up, is that this is something that I certainly noticed in the frontline work that I did, is, children who have been abused, children who have been traumatized, moving through, I worked with kids who had gone through 20 plus group homes. What that does to a traumatized brain to just be constantly in flux and not have that security. And the same goes for many, many, many other situations, treatment, not having treatment programs that are long enough. And all of the research and data shows us that, there need to be longer stays in treatment, and yet, the systems continuously would cut people off at, 30 days when research is telling us that they need longer. And so that essentially is that long-term therapeutic services are necessary to be able to begin integrating all of that information and to soothe that hyperactive amygdala. All right, next slide. All right, so for anyone who is not familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, is could take a look at this after. You may have to zoom in on it a little bit, but the Adverse Childhood Experience study was the largest cross-sectional longitudinal study on adverse childhood experiences and the impacts on that, on health later in life. And the ACEs study is brilliant because it essentially shows the impacts that childhood maltreatment, that childhood abuse, that trauma, and different things can have on health later in life. So what's interesting in the work that I've done with my mentors is that my teacher Jane Middleton Moss would say, why if, you know, childhood abuse, childhood trauma can contribute to health, to heart disease, why is there, even, you know, more so than many other things, it's one of the leading causes of heart disease from this study. Why is there not as much emphasis put on that? Why is there not as much emphasis put on child sexual abuse? Why is there not as much emphasis put on domestic violence and you know, child neglect? Why is all this emphasis in the media being put on, you know, these other things when this is as big of an issue determining health in our society? I think it's because of the stigma that's associated with these topics. People are still very hesitant to talk about them openly. It's much easier to talk about, you know, overeating and obesity as contributing to heart disease than it is to talk about childhood sexual abuse. So this is definitely a really important slide. I will just give you all a preface. As part of my work, I had to do the ACEs study for myself, and I am one of the top. I have 15 points out of the ACEs study. I have the top score for childhood trauma. And in my life, I have to work very hard to ensure that I'm staying healthy, because I certainly am at a higher risk for a lot of disease and health issues. So with that, we can move on to the next slide. Great. All right. And just as a follow-up to that, I would just say, you know, any of the information I'm giving you, again, I would say follow up with your own research and information. There's a lot out there in terms of ACEs. Some of the work that I've done right now is looking at adverse childhood experiences being one of the leading causes of children to be brought into human trafficking. I'm also a human trafficking researcher at Ryerson University, and there is a great study that was done in the US around that. And yeah, and looking at how, you know, the most vulnerable children are the ones that are being brought into some of the most heinous things that are going on in our society. So how can we support the people that are the most traumatized? Because they certainly are at the most highest risk for drug use, for health issues, for you know, a lower life expectancy later in life. And I will also follow that up with, there is, I've added a citation at the end for a doctor named Vanderkook, Bessel Vanderkook, and he is a doctor in the US who wrote a really great book, and he talks about how he is working to abolish the DSM, the Diagnostic Medical Resource. It's basically the Bible of mental health disorders. Him and thousands of other psychologists and psychiatrists and doctors across the US are moving to have that, to completely get rid of the DSM and rewrite it based on complex trauma, because many disorders that people get diagnosed with, such as ADD, hyperactivity disorder, may potentially be complex trauma, and they're getting misdiagnosed. All right, so healing through culture, we can move to the next slide. Because our ways have sustained us for time immemorial. So this is a quote from Dr. Leroy Littlebear. And sorry, I just had said that the citation is on the resources at the end. So you can just look at that at the very end of the presentation, or if you're able to print the slides out. In a state of flux, in a state of constant motion, things never remain the same. Things are forever changing. If we stopped and thought about it, we live in a very narrow spectrum of ideal conditions in this world. We in the native world, we try to renew these conditions that are ideal for our existence. The drumming, singing, and dancing is part of the renewal. So I would say that this is just a brilliant quote, because it tells why we have done the things that we have done for tens of thousands of years here on Turtle Island, and that our culture is drumming, singing, dancing, and the values that we carry as Indigenous people. Some of the values that I carry, you know, are inclusion, non-judgment, non-interference, and of course our 7 grandfather teachings, which are the basis of who we are. Next slide. Great. All right, so integration. So this is what the goal is when working through trauma, is to help people to, you know, whether it be through counseling and therapy, through ceremony, through, you know, meeting people where they're at in interactions, is that we're helping them to move those experiences and negative traumatic events that they've had from the amygdala in through their midbrain, and then helping to process to the frontal cortex so that they can make sense of those experiences, that they're not running on autopilot and moving through life just constantly, you know, on all the time, you know, that hyper activity that the brain has. So helping people to integrate, this is something that anyone can do in working with clients, is to, it's very simple, soothing, so providing soothing for that hyperactive brain. And I would like you to all consider, as I'm reading through these, ways that this is done already in practice, or things that you have done in the past maybe, or things that your cultural experience has brought to this. Connecting with other people. One of the most important parts of all of this is to rebuild that connection with other human beings. And we cannot do our healing unless we are in that space with other human beings. Redirection, so helping people to, you know, if they're feeling very traumatized, triggered, to help redirect them into another area, to help move, you know, move their focus or their thought processes to something else. Naming it to tame it. So again, with the idea of narrative therapy, of helping people to talk through things. You don't have to be a you know, registered psychologist. You don't have to be a master's in social work to have a conversation with somebody. And certainly in my frontline practice, that was a huge part of what I would do, is finding a safe place to sit down with people and have those conversations so that they can name what has happened to them. Maybe the first time in their lives they've been able to do that. And it takes time and patience. Acceptance and non-judgment is key. It takes lots of time. And with the programs that I am part of and the work that I've done, you know, I've constantly pushed the envelope to try to have longer term programs for clients, because those security, those connections, that ability to tell the story, the ability to soothe that hyperactive amygdala is what is helping people to integrate. And if our programs are, again, like the previous slide had said, 45 minutes once every couple weeks or 45 minutes a month, that's certainly not enough time to be able to start integrating. So next slide. All right, so helpers roles. So lifelong learning, like I said, learning across disciplines, learning, you know, on your own, reading books. I've attached some great resources here. And also at the end of the day, you know, we are the most important part of this all. If we can't take care of ourselves, it's going to be hard for us to take care of the community around us. So finding that support to take care of yourself and your own trauma, this way we'll be stronger and less triggered with the people that we are helping. Think critically, you know, think through Indian eyes. It's okay. It's good. It's a huge gift that we have as Indigenous people to think about the world around us in a different way. And that I encourage everyone to do that. And then must have the capacity to tune in or attune to those that are dysregulated. So how do we build that capacity? Through empathy, through understanding their life and their state of mind. So if we're interacting with somebody who has had a traumatic, they've been triggered, they go off the handle, you know, really being empathetic enough to know where that person is coming from. That they're not doing that because you tuning in today, and I am just going to pull up my last slide here, and I'll read that off to you all. And so essentially what I said is that culture is survival. It's not an afterthought. So this is a teaching that I got from my late friend, Mike Gladue. Culture, it's not a token. It's not something that we need to consider after we've done everything else. In the mainstream lens, that culture is essential. Culture provides an essential support network and pride in heritage. It diminishes pervasive harmful impacts of state violence, racism, and stereotypes. Racism as a form of trauma is actually something that's being looked into a lot now, and there are significant impacts that it has on people. Culture is essential for integrating traumatic experiences. Culture assists in whole brain thinking, higher thought and decision making in our frontal cortex, and integration of left and right brain thinking. So that's our linear brain and our more creative side of our brain. So through our songs, through our expression, through our dance. Ceremonies provide soothing of the overactive limbic system and the amygdala. Anybody who has been in ceremony would know, certainly understand what that means. Relationships with other human beings are essential to integrating traumatic experiences. That is something that we certainly have in abundance within our culture, is relationships with other human beings. Storytelling and healing circles are akin to narrative approaches to therapy. Externalizing our story can have powerful effects on self-actualization and empowerment. And culture is a protective factor. So numerous studies identify that. I've included a couple in the citations. And yeah, with that, I will finish up. You guys have some references and resources at the end here, and we'll have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you, Brianna. Our time has gone quickly, and we appreciate so much what you've shared with us. And so of the questions, there were a number of good ones, but we're just going to have time for one.
Okay.
And the question that we thought would be one that would be great to end on is, can you provide your number one suggestion on how intervention might be different when working with an Indigenous client who has experienced trauma?
Absolutely. Well, I think that this is a challenge for all of us as service providers, but also as managers and professionals working in a larger system, is that we have to be very cognizant about how the social, historical roots of our systems are either working at an advantage or disadvantage to our clients. And we have to be courageous enough in many circumstances to advocate for trauma-informed approaches. Like it's for example, having, longer term programs, having, programs that are really going to benefit and be able to help that person who is in that, who has been traumatized. And like they said, like 15 years, 10 years of trauma. And for us as Indigenous people, hundreds of years of intergenerational trauma are not just going to be, there's no quick fix for it. And this is what I think I need to leave everyone with here, is that there is no quick fix for the trauma that people have experienced. And that goes for ourselves as well. To be patient, to be kind to ourselves, and to be kind to our clients, and to be kind to those people that we work with, because they need that compassion, and they need advocates who are going to push the boundaries and say, well, I don't think that's going to work. Let's try this, or let's see if we can find something that's a bit more, fitting for people. And I think that that's the thing that I've come away with the most in the work that I've done, is to be able to be brave. And all of these things, for anyone who's Anishinaabe or Indigenous who's watching, is that all of these things are in our teachings. to be brave, to be patient, to be kind, to be loving, you know, and to bring that into the work that we do. We don't have to be ashamed to bring that into our work, because this is who we are, and we have a very distinct and very sacred and very special culture that has a lot of wisdom to share with the world. So I encourage you all, leave you all with that. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Brianna. And not just for sharing your wisdom during the webinar, but also for kindly providing citations, references, and things for people to follow up after the webinar. And that's really helpful. And people have asked during the webinar if there will be slides available, and certainly content slides, I think, if that's fair, Brianna.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes, like the content, maybe not images. That's often presenters do not share those, but the content and certainly the references at the end of the presentation. So we want to remind participants again that the evaluation link is in the chat box, and that this is your opportunity to find that and to have your certificate of attendance. And to end with thanking you again, Brianna, for preparing, making time to continue to share your wisdom with the hub, the network, and the stakeholders who join these webinars.
Miigwech. Have a great day, everyone.
You too.
Pamapi, Minwa.